Eleanor Reed was 58, a quiet woman whose life had slowed to the rhythm of the mountains. Each morning began the same way: a kettle on the old wood stove, a slow stretch beside the window, and the soft whine of her aging dog, Rusty, waiting for breakfast. The cabin she lived in wasn't much, just weathered pine walls, a stone fireplace, and a porch that looked out over endless evergreens. But it was all she needed. She had lived there since her husband Walter passed 5 winters ago. Their daughter Claire had been gone much longer, taken by illness before her 12th birthday. Those losses had shaped Eleanor's world into something small and still, but not bitter. She spoke to their photographs sometimes more out of habit than grief. The silence of the forest filled the spaces words used to occupy. Her days were simple: tending to a small garden, mending clothes by lamplight, keeping Rusty company as the sun went down behind the ridgeline. She no longer expected surprises, only the quiet comfort of routine. The forest had become her companion, a breathing presence she could trust. When the wind moved through the trees at dusk, Eleanor sometimes imagined it carrying voices, gentle and far away. It didn't frighten her. In some quiet corner of her heart, she believed the world still whispered back to those who listened. She just didn't know yet how deeply it would. The rain came hard that night, tapping against the cabin roof like 1,000 restless fingers. Eleanor had just finished her tea and was settling beside the fire with Rusty curled at her feet when the sound reached her. A thin, trembling cry drifting through the storm. At first she thought it was the wind playing tricks again, the kind that made lonely nights feel longer. But then it came again, higher, desperate, almost human. Rusty's ears perked up. A low growl rumbled in his throat as he stood and faced the door. "What is it, boy?" Eleanor whispered, but he was already pacing, whining toward the sound of the trees. The cry came once more, faint but clear, and something in it pulled at her. Not fear, but instinct. Someone or something was in trouble. She grabbed her lantern, slipped on her coat, and stepped into the cold rain. The night was thick with mist, the kind that swallowed light whole. Rusty trotted ahead, stopping now and then to listen. The cries led them toward the creek bed where fallen branches tangled across the mud. There, half buried under a heavy limb, she saw it, a small shape struggling weakly. She knelt, pushing the lantern closer, and froze. The creature was covered in soaked brown fur, its chest rising in shallow breaths. Its face, round, soft, with wide amber eyes, was unlike anything she'd seen. Not an animal. Not quite human either. It whimpered, a sound full of pain and fear. Eleanor's heart clenched. She hesitated only a moment before whispering, "It's all right, sweetheart," and lifting the branch. Carefully she wrapped the small, trembling body in her coat and carried it home through the rain, not yet knowing that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. By the time Eleanor reached the cabin, her coat was soaked through and the small creature in her arms was limp from exhaustion. She set the lantern on the table and laid the bundle down near the fireplace, her hands shaking from more than the cold. Rusty stood close, uneasy but silent, his head tilted as if trying to understand what his mistress had brought home. Eleanor worked quickly, just as she had years ago in the hospital where she once nursed the injured and frail. She filled a basin with warm water, tore an old sheet into strips, and began to clean the mud and blood from the creature's fur. Beneath the dirt, its skin was warm and soft. It flinched at first but didn't fight her touch, only watched her with wide, glassy eyes that held something heartbreakingly familiar: confusion, pain, and trust all at once. There," she murmured, her voice steady though her heart pounded. "You're safe now." She wrapped it tightly in a wool blanket and placed it near the fire. Its breathing steadied, slow but fragile. When she poured a bit of milk into a cup and dipped a spoon into it, the small creature hesitated, then accepted the offering. The way it blinked up at her, uncertain but grateful, made her throat tighten. Rusty eventually lay down beside the hearth, his tail thumping softly, no longer growling. The cabin filled with the quiet crackle of the fire and the steady patter of rain outside. Eleanor brushed a strand of hair from her face and looked down at her unexpected guest. "You need a name, don't you?" she whispered. After a long pause, she smiled faintly. "Sammy," she said. "You look like a Sammy." The little creature gave a faint, breathy sound, something close to a sigh, before its eyes drifted shut. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt her house wasn't empty. She sat watching the fire, one hand resting near the blanket, feeling an ache she thought she'd buried start to warm again. The days that followed were quiet and tender, marked by a rhythm Eleanor hadn't felt in years. Sammy slept most of the first 2 days, curled near the hearth where the warmth never faded. When he finally began to stir, it was with slow, careful movements, a cautious glance, a twitch of his small fingers, a soft grunt when she came near. But he didn't shy away. Eleanor spoke to him the way she once spoke to her daughter when she was small, calm, patient, never expecting answers, but offering comfort through tone alone. "You're safe here, little one," she would say, her voice steady and low. "No one's going to hurt you." She brushed the tangles from his fur with an old comb, each stroke gentle and measured. Sammy would sit perfectly still, his eyes half closed, the faintest hum rising from his chest. He was learning to trust her, not all at once, but in small, steady pieces. When he took food from her hand for the first time, she caught herself smiling without realizing it. Rusty, once wary, became a silent guardian. He'd lie beside Sammy when Eleanor stepped out to fetch water, his old eyes watchful but kind. Sometimes Eleanor would look over from her chair and see the two of them together, a gray-muzzled dog and a strange little creature from the woods, and feel something in her heart loosen. At night, when the wind howled through the valley, she hummed the lullaby her mother used to sing, an old tune from the coast. Sammy, half asleep, would echo it softly in his own rough voice, the sound low and haunting but beautiful in its way. It had been years since Eleanor had cared for anyone, years since she'd felt needed. Now her days had meaning again, feeding, cleaning, comforting. Each sunrise brought a reason to get up. Each small noise from Sammy reminded her that she wasn't alone anymore. Sometimes she'd catch herself whispering, "You've saved me, haven't you?" Though she wasn't sure if he could understand. The truth was she barely understood it herself, only that her heart, long quiet, had begun to beat with purpose again. Weeks turned into months, and Eleanor watched in quiet wonder as Sammy grew stronger. His movements became steadier. Where he once stumbled over his own feet, he now ran across the cabin floor with surprising grace. Each day brought small milestones: a tentative hand raised to reach a cup of water, a careful step over Rusty's sprawled body, a tilt of the head that seemed almost thoughtful. He began to mimic her gestures, leaning over to pat the fire when she did, raising his hand to shield his eyes from the morning sun, even picking up her spoon and attempting to stir the soup with awkward precision. Eleanor smiled at each attempt, clapping softly or letting out a gentle laugh that made Sammy freeze and then grin shyly. Communication between them developed slowly without words, through glances, gestures, and the occasional soft hum. Eleanor took time to teach him gentle habits. She showed him how to wash his hands in the basin before meals, how to place the utensils back neatly, and how to offer Rusty a small portion of food before taking his own. Sammy absorbed it all with an eagerness that surprised her. There were mistakes, of course: spilled milk, a tipped cup, a pan slid across the table, but they always ended in laughter rather than frustration. Some evenings, she would tell him stories of her daughter, of her late husband, or of the small town she had once lived in. Sammy would listen, tilting his head, occasionally humming or reaching for her hand. Rusty would lie nearby, tail thumping in contentment. Eleanor often caught herself marveling at the quiet beauty of it all. A strange, small creature from the forest, now part of her home, learning and growing under her care. Life, she realized, had returned to her cabin in ways she had never expected. Every day with Sammy felt like a gift, each shared smile or successful lesson a reminder that even the loneliest hearts could find connection again. It was a crisp morning when Eleanor first noticed the footprints. They were massive, far larger than any human could leave, pressed into the soft earth around the edge of the clearing. At first she thought perhaps a log had fallen oddly, leaving strange impressions in the mud. But as she stepped closer, the deep grooves and wide toe marks told a different story. Something heavy, something deliberate had been moving near her cabin while she slept. She didn't panic, but a quiet unease settled over her. Sammy, who had been playing near the garden, froze and looked toward the tree line. His ears twitched and he emitted a low, almost imperceptible hum. Eleanor followed his gaze and held her breath. There, just beyond the edge of the forest, were two large figures. They were tall, easily 8 feet, with thick brown fur that shimmered in the sunlight. Their faces were partially hidden in shadow, but Eleanor could see their eyes, sharp and aware, tracking every movement. They did not approach. They simply stood silent and watchful, as if assessing her, the cabin and the small creature by her side. Sammy stiffened and reached out a hand toward them. His chest rose and fell quickly, a low sound escaping him. A sound Eleanor had never heard before. He recognized them instinctively. There was no fear in his reaction, only recognition, a bond older than any time he had spent with her. Eleanor knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his back. Her heart tightened. She realized then what had been coming all along. These were his parents. These were the ones who had been searching, perhaps even grieving for the child they had lost. A bittersweet ache filled her chest. She had nurtured him, loved him, given him a home when the world had turned away, but she knew now that her time with him could not last forever. She whispered softly, more to herself than to Sammy, "You belong to the forest, little one, and you always will." The two figures remained on the ridge for a while, silent and watchful, before retreating slowly into the trees. Eleanor held Sammy close, feeling the weight of both her joy and her impending loss, knowing the day of parting would come sooner than she had imagined. Dawn broke slowly over the mountains, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Eleanor had stayed awake most of the night, restless, listening to the wind sigh through the trees and Rusty's steady breathing by her side. She had known this day would come, the day when Sammy would return to the forest and to the family he had been missing. Yet knowing did little to steel her heart. The sound came first, a low, rhythmic crunch of heavy footsteps on wet leaves. Eleanor rose and stepped onto the porch, her eyes scanning the mist-shrouded clearing. There they were, two towering figures moving silently toward the edge of the trees, and between them, smaller, now taller, was Sammy. He froze when he saw her, a small shiver running through his frame. Eleanor's breath caught. She moved slowly toward him, kneeling in the damp grass. "Sammy," she whispered, voice tight with emotion. She cupped his small, furred face in her hands, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath the wet strands of hair. "You have to go now. You belong with them. I can't hold you here forever." Sammy tilted his head, his deep amber eyes searching hers, understanding in a way no human could fully comprehend. Slowly, he reached out and rested one large hand over hers, pressing it gently. For a long moment, Eleanor felt the connection between them, the bond of care, trust, and love she had nurtured over months. It was heavy, unspoken, but absolute. The wind rustled through the trees as the family began moving forward. Sammy's eyes flicked toward his parents, then back at Eleanor. He gave a small, almost human sigh and finally let go of her hand. She watched as he walked into the mist with them, each step taking him further from her world and closer to his own. Eleanor remained kneeling for a while, her fingers lingering in the cold morning grass. Tears traced quiet lines down her cheeks, unheeded, unashamed. Rusty nuzzled her hand, sensing her sorrow. The forest seemed to exhale, the clearing empty once more, yet somehow full of the echoes of what had passed. She stood slowly, brushing the dew from her coat, and whispered into the silence, "Go, my little one. Be safe. Be happy." And though the clearing was empty, Eleanor felt the weight of a love that neither time nor distance could ever truly erase. The days after Sammy's departure stretched quietly, almost painfully, through Eleanor's cabin. The hearth, once warm with the gentle hums of her small companion, sat cold and still. Rusty, though loyal as ever, seemed to move more slowly, occasionally glancing toward the doorway as if expecting Sammy to return. Eleanor went through her routines mechanically, tending the garden, brewing her tea, mending clothes. But each task felt lighter, almost hollow, without the little creature's presence to fill the spaces of the cabin. She folded Sammy's small woolen blanket with care and placed it neatly beside his wooden bowl, now empty and polished from repeated use. The objects were simple, yet they held the memory of countless mornings filled with timid smiles, careful meals, and the warmth of a bond that had grown stronger than she had imagined possible. Each time she glanced at them, a mixture of sadness and gratitude settled over her chest. Word of strange tracks near the cabin reached the neighbors eventually. A few hikers mentioned seeing footprints far larger than any human could leave, and someone joked about forest monsters. Eleanor would nod politely, saying nothing. Her eyes often flicked toward the tree line, where she had last seen Sammy disappear into the mist. She knew the truth of what had come and gone, and she understood that some things were never meant to be explained. In the evenings, Eleanor returned to her journal. She wrote slowly, each word deliberate, capturing the quiet miracle of what had happened in her life. A kind soul taught me how to love again, not the kind of love that comes and goes, but the kind that waits quietly, without asking, without demanding. He was small, fragile, and yet he filled my house and heart in ways I thought were impossible. I will always remember him. The way he looked at me, the way he learned, the way he trusted. The forest holds him now, but a piece of him remains here with me. Sometimes she would pause, lifting her eyes to the window that overlooked the garden and the dense trees beyond. The forest was silent yet full of presence, and Eleanor felt it watching over her as it had always done. She understood then that love, real love, did not need constant proof. It endured in memory, in small objects and quiet glances, and in the heartbeats of those who had given it and received it. The cabin had returned to silence, but it was no longer empty. It carried the echoes of Sammy's presence, gentle reminders of the warmth, trust, and connection that had transformed her days, and perhaps in its own way, had saved her heart. It had been months since Eleanor had last seen Sammy. The cabin had settled into its quiet routine once more, the days predictable and the nights long. Spring had finally arrived, softening the forest with new growth and delicate blossoms. The air smelled of damp earth and budding leaves, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden shafts. Eleanor was sitting by the window mending a worn sweater when she heard it, a low melodic hum, almost like the sound he used to make when he was content, just beyond the porch. Her heart skipped. She set the sweater aside and rose, stepping carefully across the creaking wooden floor. Rusty lifted his head, ears alert, tail wagging with a cautious excitement. Eleanor opened the door slowly, holding the frame as if steadying herself for a dream she wasn't sure was real. There he was. Sammy, taller now, broader in the shoulders, his fur shining with health in the fading light. His amber eyes, still full of the same intelligence and trust, met hers immediately. For a moment, Eleanor could not speak, could not move. He stepped closer, each movement measured, calm yet deliberate. And then she noticed another presence beside him, a small Bigfoot child, barely a year old by her estimation. Sammy's own child. The sight struck her with warmth and awe. This tiny creature mirrored everything she had come to know about him. The same wide, curious eyes, the soft brown fur, the hesitant but trusting demeanor. Sammy knelt for a moment, lowering his head toward Eleanor. From somewhere beneath his arm, he gently placed something at her feet. Eleanor looked down. It was the small wool blanket she had wrapped him in those first nights, still worn, still soft, a tangible reminder of the bond they had shared. Her hands trembled as she touched it, tears pooling in her eyes. He looked at her one last time, the amber glow of his eyes meeting hers in quiet understanding. A soft hum escaped his lips, a farewell, a promise, and then he turned. The small child followed, their movements careful and silent, disappearing into the forest as the last light of day faded behind the trees. Eleanor sank to her knees on the porch, clutching the blanket. "Sammy," she whispered, voice trembling, repeating his name over and over as if saying it could keep him near. But she knew he was gone, back to the life that was always meant for him. And yet somehow the forest felt alive with his presence, leaving her heart both heavy and full, touched forever by the love they had shared. The cabin was quiet once more, yet Eleanor no longer felt the emptiness that had lingered after Sammy's first departure. She kept the small wool blanket he had left on her table, folded carefully beside the framed photograph of her daughter. The sight of them together, a symbol of both loss and love regained, brought a soft warmth to her chest. Rusty lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, watching the shifting shadows of the late afternoon sunlight. Eleanor often found herself staring out the window, toward the trees where Sammy had disappeared, remembering the way he had looked at her, gentle, intelligent, and full of a trust that had never wavered. In her mind, she replayed the quiet moments they had shared, the hums by the fire, the careful brushing of his fur, the first time he had taken a spoon from her hand, and the final farewell at dawn. Every detail remained vivid, etched into her memory like carvings in the bark of the ancient pines outside. She spoke softly to the cabin itself, as if it could hear her gratitude. "The forest gave me back what life had taken," she said aloud, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. Love doesn't end, it just changes form, and she knew it was true. Though Sammy had returned to the wild, and the life he was meant to live, the love he had left behind endured. It was in the blanket, in the empty hearth, in Rusty's watchful eyes, and in her own heart that had begun to beat fully again. "He wasn't a monster," she whispered, voice trembling yet resolute. "He was a son, and when he came back I knew I was never forgotten." For Eleanor, the forest was no longer merely trees and silence. It was home to a love that crossed boundaries, bridged worlds, and proved that the heart, even one long acquainted with grief, could still find joy, connection, and hope in the most unexpected of places.